Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thanks, as ever, to Cyrus, echoing everybody else, for both the really interesting conference and also your openness and spirit of collaboration. So I am talking today about art and the Cold War in the Middle East and North Africa. Modern art was a battleground for Cold War ideas, from its aesthetics to its exhibition in the Arab world and beyond. Throughout the Cold War, art was actively used as a tool for soft power in the United States and the USSR, and further afield as they sought international influence. The use of art as a political tool extended to how both blocs interacted with the Arab countries of the Middle East and North Africa. Because Arab art existed within a political space impacted by the pressures of the Cold War, the politically charged art and artistic movements that arose were equally impacted by these larger global alignments and how they were articulated locally. And thinking especially of the War of '67, which was quite significant and shifted quite a lot within the modernist art movements around the region. However, this chapter approaches the question of art in the Middle East and North Africa during the Cold War from the perspective of institutional alignments more than individual artistic practices, focusing primarily on structural engagements in the form of art acquisitions, study abroad, and exhibition programs. This chapter argues that both the United States and the Soviet Union actively sought political influence in the Arab world through the indirect soft power of culture. Arts funding was used as an arm in the ideological battle between the two sides. Arab modernism cannot be reduced to direct outcomes from foreign intervention, but seeing the significant impact of the Cold War on the arts also helps to ground nation-based movements in the larger extranational histories of global modernism. So thinking about abstraction and socialist realism. During the Cold War, modern art was framed internationally as a visual expression of the values aligned with each bloc. In broader arts discourse, abstraction linked to the United States was diametrically opposed to socialist realism linked to the USSR, aligning an aesthetic difference with the belief in a political cleavage of the world along the same contours. In the United States, the CIA funded abstract expressionist artists, especially Jackson Pollock, seen here. Within the modernist idea of art for art's sake, abstraction was celebrated precisely for being devoid on the surface of political messaging. This impacted Arab abstraction, even though not all Arab abstraction should be understood through this lens. There was simultaneously a focus among a number of Arab artists on abstraction as part of an Arab Islamic ontology, and therefore a proclamation of local identity that predated colonialism. So here, for instance, the Madiha Umar is based on abstractions of Arabic letters. So really thinking about abstraction as coming out of the Arab world specifically, in comparison to Mohammed Malehi's Times Square, which was done while he was in New York on a Rockefeller Foundation fellowship. Going back to here. So as the United States actively pushed American artists to create large-scale abstractions, the USSR insisted upon socialist realism, meaning that across the two blocs, the form itself of modern painting was politically salient. Socialist realism was proclaimed in 1934 by Maxim Gorky and reiterated by Nikita Khrushchev in 1962 when he created an official prohibition of non-realist art. Painters were expected to use realist styles to portray Soviet life through an optimistic lens intended to inspire trust in the party and its policies. Socialist realism became connected to Soviet internationalism as the USSR sought political influence in the Third World, and so the aesthetic became further framed as a tool for decolonization. Arab artists were exposed to concepts of socialist realism, then took these ideas and translated them within a local lexicon. So here, for example, is Abdelaziz Nashawadi's painting, My Children Before the Exam, from 1957, which won the top prize at Syria's national exhibition sponsored by the Ministry of Education. which would have been understood in relation to socialist realism given the exhibition exchange program between Syria and the USSR. There are blocks of color which suggest abstract modernism, and you can see that this isn't a great slide, but if you look, for instance, at the Bois shirt, as opposed to being modeled, you see that this is based on squares and rectangles. But still, there is also this focus on children who are working with the light that is streaming onto their faces. To be clear, the binary between abstraction and socialist realism is overly simplified. Lisa Jakielski, writing about modernist music in Warsaw, argues, and I'll quote here, "If the dichotomy between modernism and socialist realism seems simplistic, that's because it is. Applied to musical aesthetics, Cold War rhetoric lent itself far more readily to reductive binary sloganeering than to sophisticated analysis. It remains all too easy to conceptualize each side as a monolith that expressed its positions in hackneyed ways," end quote. In reality, individuals had to negotiate their own practices within the highly politicized debates around aesthetics. And it's reductive to describe all practices in these terms. However, it is simultaneously important to see how deeply invested the two blocks were in creating a false binary that was also experienced by artists as a true and weighty distinction. So I will talk first about Arab art and the United States. American influence on Arab art came through multiple channels: funding for study and exhibition in the United States, funding for cultural initiatives abroad, and funding for academic institutions abroad. These were meant to directly or indirectly transmit American values to be further disseminated abroad and to solidify American influence. Within the United States, in addition to fellowships through sources such as the Rockefeller Foundation, American Cold War influence on Arab art came in part from the American Friends of the Middle East, the AFME, a CIA front group that was founded in 1951. In addition to scholarships and conferences, the AFME also initiated a variety of activities, including a Department of Intercultural Relations to oversee art exhibitions and visits by Arab artists to the United States. Among multiple other artists, they sponsored a major touring exhibition by Iraqi modernist artist Jawad Salim, seen here, which was accompanied by a lecture series and media appearances, and which also led to multiple American acquisitions of his work. In addition to the AFME, the major international cultural propaganda for the CIA during the Cold War was run as the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which is the CCF. The CCF was very active with offices in 35 countries and was meant to attract the intelligentsia away from Marxism and communism and towards American values. While primarily focused on Western Europe, the CCF funded arts and culture in Africa and the Middle East, including Beirut-based publications Hiwar and briefly Adab, as well as Black Orpheus, which was published out of Abadan. The CIA and CCF coordinated a response to the post-Bandung Afro-Asian Solidarity Movement, seeking to infiltrate it and direct its energies towards pro-American perspectives through the soft power of culture. Some funding also went directly to academic institutions to encourage American influence, particularly the American University of Beirut. Beirut was strategically important after the Eisenhower Doctrine, which sought to strengthen Arab governments with pro-American tendencies, and this extended to the arts. AUB's new art department was headed by American artist Marriott Charlton, who was an artist who taught individualism and freedom of expression, which is, of course, in line with American ideas around abstraction. These larger cultural activities cannot be reduced to American funding, but Americans strategically and deliberately sought political influence through these initiatives, often linked to abstraction. Turning now to Arab art and the USSR. Significant cultural exchanges between the USSR and the Middle East and North Africa were present from the 1950s on, and the first exhibition in Moscow to include Arab art took place in 1957. Due to the shifting global dynamics of decolonization, the USSR sought cultural influence within the Third World, and arts exchanges became a politically charged terrain to align the USSR with the anti-colonial liberation movements. These cultural initiatives took the form of scholarships for study abroad in the Eastern Bloc, as well as state-initiated programs for exhibition exchange. Though substantial, the impact of the Soviet Union on art practices from the Middle East and North Africa has been largely understudied, if not ignored. Study abroad programs in the USSR sought to create alliances through the soft power of culture, as well as an expansion of Soviet cultural values when students returned to their home countries. The USSR signed agreements of cultural cooperation with Syria in 1956, Egypt in 1957, and Iraq in 1958. Many prominent art schools in the Soviet Union and the larger Eastern Bloc participated in exchange programs meant to attract Arab artists, including state institutions in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Students inside the USSR were required to take a year of Russian language classes because classes were then held in Russian and included both foreign and Russian students. In addition to hosting students, exhibition exchanges were a means of deliberately connecting the USSR and the Arab world. The Soviet Union sent touring exhibitions of fine, graphic, and applied arts to countries in the Arab world throughout the 1960s and 1970s, including Syria, Libya, Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. Simultaneously, Arab art was also shown in the USSR. For example, the bilateral cultural exchange between Egypt and the USSR resulted in exhibitions in Moscow of Egyptian art in 1957, 1958, 1966, 1968, and 1972. The interest in Arab art shown in touring exhibitions and festivals was also mirrored in Soviet institutions. The State Museum of Oriental Art in Moscow actively showed and collected Arab art within exhibitions of contemporary art from Syria, Iraq, and the United Arab Republic, and had major acquisitions, including by Egyptian artists such as Ingia Flatoun, who is seen here. Lacunae in current scholarships minimize the impactful role that the USSR and the Eastern Bloc actively sought and instituted in relation to Arab art. As in the silence around Moscow in Aflatoon's career, despite significant contemporary art world interest in her. So here you can see that some of her earlier work was shown this year at the Venice Biennale. New research suggests to the contrary that the USSR was seen as an influential artistic center. Moving finally to non-alignment. Non-alignment was particularly important in Egypt, given Nasser's role in both the Bandung Conference of 1955 and the non-aligned movement, which had its second meeting in Cairo in 1964. Artistic responses to non-alignment varied in their aesthetics and included both abstraction and realism. For example, the nationalization of the Suez Canal was captured in artistic practices in Egypt that focused on Nasser's role as a leader for non-alignment, national pride, and liberation. So you see on the right, there is Nasser and the nationalization of the canal, and on the left, this is also a work that is about the nationalization of the canal, which won a prize at a 1957 exhibition in Moscow, and you can see that it's somebody pulling apart the bars to liberate himself with a dove flying out. In the 1960s, the Egyptian government then commissioned a selection of artists to observe the construction of the Aswan Dam and memorialize it in art. The dam, and so you can see here are two examples of these artists that were commissioned to go see the dam, show it in art, and then responded to it very differently through certainly abstraction on the left. The dam, as a sign of national identity and pride, was placed definitively in the context of non-alignment with Abdelhadi El-Ghazar's painting Peace in 1965. This painting imaginatively portrays the second summit of the non-aligned movement, which took place in Cairo in '64. A central figure, you can see way in the back, that resembles Nasser, presides over the group of both historical and allegorical figures, unifying both forms of labor as well as nature and technology. The USSR shifted its strategies following Bandung and began to support non-alignment. While the United States sought cultural influence in the Third World without overt political support for non-alignment, as in funding Black Orpheus, the USSR more actively sought to financially support arts practices rooted in politics of non-alignment, as in the funding of the prominent decolonial journal Lotus Afro-Asian Writings. If non-alignment within the arts was therefore heavily linked to the USSR following Bandung, it should not be subsumed by Soviet influence using the totalizing logic of the Cold War. As in the regionalism of the Alexandria Biennale, founded in 1955, concepts of non-alignment impacted multiple forms of collaboration. So in conclusion, the notion that the formal characteristics of modern art can be reduced to two aesthetics that correspond neatly to two ideological camps, with abstraction in the first world and socialist realism in the second world, is, of course, too simplistic. Yet hegemonic Cold War ideologies sought this easy binary in the arts and beyond. Modern art became a battleground for political influence, and both the American and Soviet governments actively sought to control how modern art was seen and what it meant as a reflection of their political divisions. Both governments thereby used funding to alternately support and punish certain kinds of arts at home, and both governments used international arts funding and exhibition as a tool for soft power abroad. Arab modernism can therefore be understood during the Cold War both in relation to heavily politically determined conceptions of artistic practice and in relation to the dueling priorities exercised through arts funding. Yet it also cannot be reduced to these imperatives. To write about the Cold War is in part to recognize that these ideas existed as a concrete reality that artists debated, critics expounded upon, and governments funded. Yet this history simultaneously requires us to find the nuances that were denied and to vociferously insist that Arab modernism was articulated in local and regional terms that were impacted but not predetermined by these global alignments. Thank you.
All right, thanks for being here. Thank you, Cyrus, for organizing. Thanks to the student workers for, making everything work. I'm PERIN, and I'm going to be talking about gender in the Cold War, Middle East, and North Africa. And I have 4 goals in my paper and kind of in this presentation. Although, as I was telling a colleague, this is kind of like the high school condensed Sparks Notes version of what I'm trying to do. But my 4 goals that I hope you'll participate with me is 1, looking at gender as a category of analysis. I'm referencing, of course, Joan Scott here, as a way of signifying relations of power, naturalizing them, contesting them, and specifically in the Cold War MENA region. 2, examining how changes in gender norms in the MENA intersected with the Cold War, specifically with regards to the ideological debate between capitalist ways of life and Soviet ways of life, and the ways in which the family became increasingly politicized as a symbol of different ideological affiliations. All right, 3. This is 3. Okay. Studying how the rise of a global feminist movement intersected with the Cold War, specifically looking at the 1975-1985 UN Decade for Women and the tensions that were sparked between socialist and third world feminists and Western feminists during that era, with focus on the ways in which gender intersects with race, class, nationality. And 4, very briefly, I want to kind of touch upon Islamism as a gendered product of the Cold War. So that's a lot. Gender is doing some heavy work here. And I have my email up there because I am basically asking you to help me with these 4 projects. So as you look into your archives, think about your eras, think about your interlocutors. Maybe I'm hoping you can think about how gendered language might be used in representing selves and others, in naturalizing hierarchies or helping people contest them, and how gender will be intersecting with race, class, religion, nationality, right? Orientalism is one example that I'll give there that I'll talk a little bit more about. So that's kind of the Scott plus Black feminism version, part of the question. And then I have my Cynthia Unlow question, right? Of where are the women, right? What are they doing? We're 51% of the world. And, if you've met Middle Eastern women, we have things to say. So how are the women participating? What are they doing? And I actually loved seeing some of the women artists in my colleagues' presentation here. So I am hoping that you can weave in gender and race and class into your presentations. And if you don't want to do it, just send your materials to me, and I'll put it into my presentation. All right? All right. Let's go. What are we doing here? All right. Let's see some more ladies. Okay. So Cold War was a period of intense ideological, political, and cultural rivalry between the capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union, and gender norms became a key signifier of ideological affinity within the Middle East and North Africa. As my colleagues have mentioned, Middle Eastern, North African states had their own gendered concerns in politics. They did not always align with superpower goals, but as different ways of life became politicized, women's role became a key signifier of like a communist society or a capitalist consumer society. And I have like sort of 2 stereotypical representations of communist and capitalist women's ideal. Obviously, Joan Cleaver symbolizes, especially during the early Cold War, of like how American policymakers, almost all of whom were men, envisioned the role of women, American women, and really the world women, if they could help it. After World War II, women are coming back to the house, right? Baby boom, kitchens, washing machines, right? That they perceived women's rightful, natural role as being mothers, child rearers, and also sort of moral guardians against the corrupting ideology of communism. And sort of women were charged with like sort of preventing homosexuality, right? You know about the lavender scare. Women were charged with carrying the symbolic burden. And of course, they are charged with consuming, helping the American economy. And on the other side, sort of the stereotypical image, or the most salient image in some ways, of Soviet womanhood, of communist womanhood, is Valentina Tereshkova, who became the first woman in space. And she actually orbited around space more than the 3 Americans that the American men that the United States had sent, longer than they had orbited. And that generated a crisis and actually a rethinking of U.S. gender norms as well. All right, so that's what the United States and the Soviet Union are doing. United States is promoting this traditional gender roles within a nuclear family model. Because of the writings of Marx and Engels, the USSR, at least on paper, but also in practice, is committed to women's emancipation from the domestic sphere and their participation in labor, their civic presence. And MENA states are kind of aware of these models, and they also have their own national and ideological agendas, and are kind of responding to these ideological images that are disseminating from the superpowers. Obviously, we have a media boom, right? Magazines like Life and also propaganda apparatuses, they spread these ideals throughout the world. All right, in the MENA, as many of our colleagues mentioned, primary concerns during this period are decolonization and nationalism and gendered rhetoric, and expansion of women's civic roles very much intersect with that. A lot of nationalist liberation movements, especially left liberation movements, but all of them have robust participation from women in the Middle East. And decolonization also, of course, comes with gendered rhetoric, right, about protecting the nation's nation's honor, having sort of resolute masculine identity to push back against the outsiders, the invaders. The heightened rhetorical and ideological confrontation between communism and capitalism means that gender, again, we talked about chronological, right, organization, like all this sort of feminism dates long before the Cold War and has always intersected with nationalism, questions of national identity, and decolonization. But it does become heightened during this period, and gender becomes a key signifier of ideological affinity and national progress. Another thing that we have to think about here is the gendered heritage of Orientalism, which very much influences how the superpowers view the MENA, and the Soviet Union has its own sort of Orientalist approach to the Muslim majority regions it controls, right? It's like the East is a delicate matter, and the United States obviously inherits the European heritage of Orientalism that sees the East as kind of decadent, in need of masculine guidance, and these kinds of civilizational ideas and gendered ideas play a role, including in the colonization of Palestine, colonization, and the mandate system across the Middle East. So there are many examples that I'm sure you can find as well of how the U.S. media and U.S. elites use gender language to talk about their allies and enemies. The differing views of U.S. views of Israel as the United States began to consider and move towards an alliance with Israel. You have more and more representations of Israel as kind of masculine and youthful, stalwart ally, in comparison to other states in the region. So in some ways, these military victories are represented as like, okay, this is like a cool dude that we can ally with. There are comparisons also made between Turkey, which gets incorporated into NATO, and this is from Time magazine, the hysterically anti-imperialist Arab nations, right? Again, Turkey goes a gendered revision in its identity during this period, from being like the terrible, rapacious Turk to kind of like, oh, like another masculine, youthful ally that we can align with. So there's a lot of gender language. There's a lot of gender language in U.S. views of Mossadegh versus the Shah as well, right? Real men don't wear pajamas. If you know that article by Marianne Heiss, like Mossadegh is like basically too feminine, too weak to resist communism. And Shah, at least in the early stages, is kind of represented as like, oh, modernizing, progressive, like masculine leader. Right. I talk a little bit about that in my forthcoming book. I don't know if I should talk about it, but the book is called America's Wife, America's Concubine, Turkey, Iran, and the Politics of Comparison. And it comes from the quote that Shah actually makes to John F. Kennedy during a meeting where he says, America treats Turkey as a wife and Iran as a concubine. So we can think about he's using gender and sexuality to signify relations of power, right? Who is the daddy, who's the husband, who's the wife, and who's the concubine, right? And you can think about these men, Kennedy and the Shah, and their relationship to their own partners, and we get to see how politics becomes gendered and sexualized. All right. As many feminist scholars have written, nationalism and feminism have gone hand in hand in the MENA region, as really elsewhere across the decolonizing world. Left nationalist liberation movements in particular vastly boosted women's participation in multiple roles, civic roles, including in military endeavors. These are just some very vibrant symbolic examples of that. If you have seen or assigned the Battle of Algiers, you know the critical role that Algerian women played in fighting against French colonialism, and Palestinian women have been an essential part of the struggle from the beginning, as Margaret Badran talks about, sort of doing stuff related to their class background, right? The more educated upper class women writing petitions, organizing boycotts, and peasant women oftentimes sort of participating in rebellions. And sort of the iconic image of the Palestinian woman with a gun is Layla Khaled of the PLO, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and she becomes an icon. Like you can see murals of her from Ireland to wherever you're going to go. And, obviously her being sort of presentable in a certain way, aligns with the sort of spirit of the 60s. And she becomes the first woman to ever hijack an airplane. So we can think of her in comparison, like the first woman in space, right? Dubious. But nevertheless, telling something about women's roles in national liberation movements. All right. And these are icons that are kind of romanticized as well. And Algerian women, after the battle is won, very much are kind of pushed back from their public roles. And with the rise of Islamism, they actually experience a great setback in their rights as well. So we'll talk about that later. All right. So we have national liberation movements. We also have state feminism in the Middle East and North Africa. In general, socialist aligned and communist states advanced women's rights in comparison, especially to U.S. aligned monarchies that often lagged behind. So we have this sort of ideological core of communism that considers women's liberation a part of workers' liberation, and that boosts, and again, sort of nationalist reasons, that boosts women's roles in MENA. And you have sort of different situation going on, even though like even in Saudi Arabia, there are changes at this time. So it's a part of modernization. Some U.S. aligned and U.S. friendly regimes, Turkey, Iran, Tunisia, do promote women's rights within the framework of nationalist modernization. So once again, it's not as sharp a divide. I would say women's rights are improving to a certain extent across MENA in various capacities. And I'll talk a little bit about, not about Turkey. We talked about how like there isn't enough Turkey in this, so I'll have to, I feel like it's my role to like amend that a little bit. But I am actually gonna talk about Iran as an example. In Egypt, Nasser very much suppresses independent women's organizing. Inji Aflatun, whom my colleague talked about, is a very important participant in women's organizing, women's socialist organizing. She participated in the 1949 sort of Women of Asia conference. She's a communist. She's actually imprisoned by Nasser. So I don't want to draw this like, ooh, Nasser saved Egyptian women picture. However, his sort of Arab socialism is committed, again, on paper and to a certain extent, like women's uplifting liberation within a nationalist framework. The 1956 Constitution endorses equality. 1962 National Charter confirms equal rights, saying women must be considered equal to men. And you have women like Aziza Shukra Hussein, who became the first Arab women serve in the United Nations. In Iraq, under Qasim's republic, you have gynecologist Naziha al-Dulaimi, who is a Communist Party member and becomes Iraq's first female minister. She advocates for women's education and labor rights. And within revolutionary Syria, you have a great role that General Union of Syrian Women play in boosting political participation. So you have these increased visibility and participation and increased rights for Muslim, well, actually not Muslim, for all Middle Eastern women across the board. And really the shining example of that is People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, a communist state that enshrined women's equality in the Constitution, and they were very much committed to combining class liberation with women's liberation, and this was something that a lot of socialist and communist states would do, expanding women's education. They offered paid maternity leave. Hello, United States. Tear falls from, state-funded childcare, and they were actually able to reform the family law, which has been very resistant to reform throughout the Middle East. And so it was enough of a shining example that at sort of meetings of Arab states, it would tout it. It was very critically viewed by conservative Arab monarchies and criticized for basically corrupting Yemeni women. But it is remembered as like this exception in some ways. Communism, yay. All right, don't tell Trump. I'm I'm sorry, okay, I didn't, these are my sources. All right, Iran, all right, look, some U.S.-aligned states did some things, okay? Under their very feminist leader, Shah, I'm kidding, the Shah was like so sexist. Anyway, we'll talk about him. No, we won't talk about him. You know what? We'll talk about these women. The Shah's twin sister, Ashraf Pahlavi, was very much involved in the global women's rights movement, but her role usually justified, focused on justifying the Shah's rule. And she was a very controversial figure because she was associated with garb zadagi, over-Westernization or West-toxication, and she was associated with corruption. So she was pretty unpopular, and often compared to her as a positive model. I have written about her, and she's also it is in a chapter of my book, Empress Farah. She was kind of represented as this modern woman focused on really maternal and child health. Also was a huge art collector, right? And put Persian art on the radar internationally. But she's kind of organizing art festivals. She also becomes a political figure of her own right, visiting China in the wake of the Shah's own visit to the Soviet Union. But she, even though she's cutting a very maternal figure, like a schoolgirl Cinderella story, she's also, am I running on time? Okay, wrapping up? Okay, soon. Okay, sorry, I could talk about her forever. But she's also gets attacked as a symbol of Westernization. We have Minister of Women's Rights, Mahnaz Afghani, who oversees the reform of the Civil Code, which does improve women's rights in marriage and divorce to a certain extent, but not fully, not equally. And she talks about how the Shah basically wanted to push women's rights to be seen as progressive. He was in his personal statements and his interviews were very sexist. And he told her that she shouldn't pass any law that clashes with the Sharia, that would alienate the Islamic ulema. All right, we can talk about any of these, but very quickly, 1963, there is a shift in U.S. approach to gender. So some of this June Cleaver sort of stuff is coming under concern, partially because of the first female cosmonaut, comes out at the same time as the feminine mystique, and America starts to freak out, basically, especially the ways in which, the feminine mystique echoes some of these communist critiques of housewives' captivity, even as Betty Friedan basically hides her own leftist history in union organizing. But they already have this idea that women's status reflects civilization rank, and they're getting afraid that they're going to lose out to these communist states who are making huge advances. So United States becomes more interested in including women in development, and they begin sort of family development initiatives, and actually Tunisia becomes the first Arab aid recipient to work with the United States on getting birth control. Oh gosh, okay. Global women's movement begins, well, it has a very long history, but after World War II, it is very much socialist in appearance and in status. There is the Women's International Democratic Federation that organizes the first alliances among, socialist and third world women's activists. Gotzi writes about it, you can read about that. Western women increasingly get involved, focus on individual rights and criticize politicization, but they don't like it when other intersectional issues are brought up, right? And they basically say the socialist and third world activists are imitating the male in his political games, and there's a lot of beef. And the 1975 Mexico UN City Conference highlights these divisions. I think I have to wrap up, but ask me about that, no?
5 more minutes.
5 more minutes, okay, let me tell you about the beef. All right, the earliest conferences, actually, it's going to relate to what Holiday said too, right? 1949 is very socialist. India Aflatun participates in it, communist, and then under sort of third worldism, you have the Afro-Asian Women's Conferences held in Colombo, 1958, and Cairo, 1961. DC, very robust participation that brings together socialist and nationalist women's activists. So they're not purely communist, and they see strong backing and strong participation from revolutionary Arab nationalist Middle Eastern nations such as Egypt. So women's activism during the early period is very much, as I said, socialist and third worldist. When the United Nations finally declares the Decade for Women in 1975, United States is afraid that the WIC, the Women's International Democratic Foundation, is going to organize it. So they, again, panic that women's rights is going to be like kind of a socialist coup. So they fund reluctantly the conference to decenter with. However, they basically refuse to sign on to the resolutions in this conference because the women organized there basically see imperialism, colonialism, Zionism, apartheid as women's issues. And United States, Israel, and a few other allied nations are like, whoa, 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 what are you talking about? The imperialism affects women? No, of course not. So repeatedly, we see kind of United States taking kind of the helm of women's rights in some ways, but also refusing to sign on to these resolutions and really playing kind of a regressive role for the most part. All right. We don't have time to talk about this. It's also kind of not in the Cold War era, but as my colleague said, the United States played a key role in the rise of Islamism across the Middle East, in its alliances with conservative states, in supporting regressive forces against Arab nationalism, and of course in helping promote an ideology of jihad, a very strict gendered ideology of jihad in the Afghan resistance against the Soviet Union. So it plays a big role in rolling back some of the gains that are made in Iran being the most obvious example, right? But also Algerian women after 1985, they have to deal with a regressive family code that they didn't have to before. So the record of Islamism is not good in general. However, there is within Islam, there is discourse, and there's long been discourse that equality before Allah of genders is very much a part of the discourse. And you have even in figures like Zainab al-Ghazali of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, you have an active women leader. So there is, Ali Shariati talks about it, right? Even Khomeini talks about sort of how women were warriors and et cetera. So there's like sort of Islamic feminism, the seeds of it at this point, but it only comes of age after the Cold War as the socialist heritage of Middle Eastern feminism sort of fades into historical memory. The end. Thank you.
All right, good morning. Thank you, Cyrus, thank the organizers. I'm going to start really briefly by saying that if you will look in the Arab intellectual record in Arabic for an article or a book on Arab thought during the Cold War, you won't find it. So in the region, Arab intellectuals did not think that there is a type, was a quality of Arab thought or a current of thought, a school of thought that is essentially owes its existence to the Cold War. So the question becomes a methodological question. How do you read the Cold War into the Arab record? Did it leave no mark on it? Of course, that historically doesn't make any sense. So what I'm trying to do now is to give you what I see as not simply the impact of the Cold War on the Arab world, but also to argue towards the end of my presentation that Arab thought, Arab culture eventually, as a political culture, was able to influence the course or several aspects of the Cold War, especially in the end towards the globalization of political Islam in the 70s and the Arab New Left, late 60s, which conjoined with European organizations, whether it's the Red Army Fraction or the Brigate Rosse or Japanese Red Army or others. So in the end, actually, there is something that you can read from thought, from culture, from art, metamorphoses into political culture. That's more or less the trajectory. But if you take a snapshot of the Arab world in the late 40s, what are their concerns? Their major concern is first of all, material, in the sense that the Arab body is sick. Life expectancy is about 35 years old, 40 years old, below that, sort of in Egypt, for women a little bit more. It's nothing. People are sick continuously. They're sick throughout their lives. There are statistics about 62% of the Egyptian population is sick. So you're chronically sick. There's a crisis of nutrition, of course, that comes with it. There's also a drug epidemic, quite significant, by the way, opium epidemic, quite significant since the 30s. And of course, there is the question, what kind of independent subject can emerge out of it? What is the new Arab subject that post-colonialism sort of is going to host in the new state with the flag and the anthem and the marching army? It's clear that you need to create a new Arab subject, a new type of Arab person. There are two projects that are happening in the Middle East. You know, the Egyptians would call it El-Insan El-Arabi Al-Jadid. In Syria, under the Ba'ath, it's more like the Arab of the future, hence the French graphic novel, L'Arabe du Futur. So there's this project. The idea is to create a new Arab subject. And the question is really material, but also ontological. What does it mean to be after colonialism? What does it mean to create a person who is authentic to itself, not forgetting, 100 years of Islamic cultural patrimony, turath, but also sovereign of his own, on her own actions, but sovereign politically. This is, to create this new subject, is to create a new person that has dignified life. And this is why dignity, karama, I mentioned it yesterday, is such a major concept, because to address the post-colonial issues, to create life with dignity. And if you look at Nasser's speeches, he's the one pushing it forward. The nationalization speech itself of 1956 has it, I think, 28 times. Karama. He inaugurates this concept, and we'll get to it because, the Battle of Karama, March 68 of the Palestinian, it happened to be in Karama by chance, but that's the connection. Now, the first thing, in order to begin to inaugurate this kind of, to create this new subject, is, as Holiday mentioned, goes to art. And to not just simply, painting, but all forms of writing. And the question is, it seems like an abstract question, art for art's sake or art for the sake of society. And say, okay, well, what do they want? Who cares? What does it matter? It matters a lot because it's a matter of ethics, and ethics are a matter of politics eventually, including state politics. So the debate begins of what are the intellectuals doing? So they write this nice poetry and the nice commentary, and they comment about Nietzsche, and they can do Western philosophy, but look at the people, right? So art has a purpose, and writing has a purpose, and intellectual has a purpose, actually to contribute to the rise of the new subject, to actually revolutionize society. And that's the birth moment of the Arab revolutionary tradition. Forget about Nasser and nationalism and all of that. It's, of course, important, but that's it, to in a way, salvage the subject, to create this subject. So art is, of course, very important. You have all these arguments between artists and writers very extensively throughout the 50s, and these, if you look at the debates themselves, they have two kind of intellectual fountainheads, and that's where the Cold War comes in. One is indeed socialist realism as an aesthetic, and then as ethics, and that, of course, comes from the Soviet Union. The other is Jean-Paul Sartre, with the idea of engagement, of engagement, in which the writer is not just there to, to create meaning, and then actually this, sublime poetry turn into reality somehow. It doesn't. And every Arab knows it doesn't. So the artist needs to be committed to the cause, eventually committed to politics of the cause. And that's the concept of iltizam. The concept of iltizam, of commitment, takes from these two Cold War traditions. The Soviet one and the Western European one, specifically existentialist one. And of course, existentialism is not the topic here, but becomes enormous in the Arab world, because of it. Now, the state and especially the Nasserite state, but also the Ba'athi state once it emerges, and Ba'athism was weak on sovereignty, was enormously creative in trying to imagine the kind of ontology that the new Syrian, the new Ba'athi subject will be embedded sort of with. There's like lots of pedagogues, and I think Holiday cited the book by Annika Larsen that actually shows, in very significant ways how this kind of connection to Henri Bergson in France through Ba'athi work was actually trying to create this subject. But eventually the state takes the project over. It is not something that intellectuals do. The state says, we'll create a subject. And Nasser created it single-handedly when he nationalized the Suez Canal. It's an act of sovereignty. He can do things. His work, his speech is sovereignty. It creates reality. And if you remember, the speech is coded. He's not going to tell them, I'm going to nationalize the Suez Canal, nothing. He speaks. The radio transmits the broadcast. The teams across the Suez Canal hear the speech on the radio, and the Suez Canal is nationalized. So Nasser already embodies this new subject, whose word is law. In that sense, this subject is not a liberal subject. It's not contractual. The relationships are not contractual. Nasser is the law. Nasser is the sovereign. And that's the model. It's also the model for the creation of masculinities. And hence, counter this of state feminism and the female subject. So all of this is very, collectivist. So that's kind of phase one and of course, the nationalization of the Suez Canal is a major act in the Cold War that, again, conjoins the decolonization and inaugurates the Cold War. It's really the time in which, okay, the Soviets and the Americans are coming together and said, okay, game over. That's the end of gunboat diplomacy, essentially, of a certain kind of European gunboat diplomacy and the beginning of a different kind of gunboat diplomacy. It's not gunboat, I don't know what is it, but. So that's phase one, and it's collectivist, and all of this project is going to be defeated in '67. But before that, there is also, within Arab thought, the enclave of Arab liberalism. And that exists in Beirut. Beirut becomes the capital of Arab thought gradually through the 50s and 60s. And at the time was admitted that Beirut is eclipsing Cairo because it didn't have socialist realism and Arab socialism and the state as a commissioning meaning, and intellectuals could actually have a space to experiment there. And the journal that is usually being mentioned in that sense, there are many, but that as a kind of a classic Cold War example of this kind of friction is YOAV, which Holiday also mentioned in her paper and presentation. Now, YOAV is edited by Tawfiq Sayer from the Sayer family. This is a Palestinian family from Tiberias, extremely well educated, extremely creative. And if there is a future in the Cold War where Arab societies, especially Beirut, is joining something more Southern European, more, really away from taking sides in the Cold War. Culturally, it will be in Beirut and it will be in this journal. Now, everybody wanted to write in YOAV. First of all, because it paid much more than any other journal. Now, Tawfiq Sayer understands, okay, where's the money? I get it from the from the Congress of Cultural Freedom and so on. But he's asking again, is this CIA money? Is this not? Again and again. And one of my friends found even some of the correspondence. They assure him, no, this is clean money. And YOAV never intervenes in the contents in the ideological content of the contribution he gets. So everybody wants to write to him. This is Arab thought that takes the Nahda tradition of the late 19th century but connects it to actually West European liberalism, but even on the left, like Pablo Neruda kind of stuff, right? That is still preferable for the CIA than anything that is really Eastern European and so on. Nobody who published with YOAV ever said that what they've written was manipulated and so on. But, Elizabeth Holt wrote a very nice article about it, and she, I think, the one who really kind of was the first to understand the significance of it. But the message is, and I kind of a little bit disagree with her, is not that the CIA is bad. Okay, of course, the CIA is bad, right? It is the fact that when it is being discovered, and it's being discovered by the Egyptians, by Egyptian intellectuals. They're the one who are beginning to say this is a CIA, and then by the New York Times and so on. When it was discovered that the CIA is behind it, Tawfiq Sayer was disowned. And all the battles that he participated in, including the sexualized writing of Leila Baalbeki, in the 60s, this enormous battle of Baalbeki, of Rada al-Saman, of these new Arab feminists, everything that he fought for was destroyed. Nobody stood by him. He retired. He moved to Berkeley. He died from a heart attack in an elevator a few years later. The question is, okay, he didn't intervene. Why all his friends, why everybody is disowning him? He did not change a word. Everybody was happy by what they published, and you cannot say, okay, it's just because the CIA is bad and so on. What was compromised is the sovereignty of the Arab intellectual. And that is exactly the inability to emerge as someone who, even when they actually put the work together, it turns out there's some kind of cosmological CIA circumstances that transmit their or distort their meaning eventually of the work. And the response is very strong to it. And the collapse of Hiwar plus the 67 war, the collapse of Hiwar is actually really a major stab in the prospects of Arab liberalism. That it was really so destructive for, nobody wanted to identify it. And that clears the ground for the Yasar al-Arabi al-Jadid, the new Arab left that emerges. Now, 67 happens. The politics of Iltizam failed. Didn't liberate Palestine. This new Arab subject that was supposed to create collapsed in the desert. It didn't even fight. It becomes, Abdul Hakim Amir, essentially, kind of like, what kind of a subject is this? And that clears the ground to different kind of politics, which is the politics of resistance, of mukawama. So from Iltizam, you move to mukawama. Now, the mukawama also starts as a literary thing. It also starts with writers, where Hassan Kanafai says, well, I found these writers in Palestine. Look how they resist. And this kind of literary resistance, and this is why, again, this literature is not just like some small thing, or the art is a small thing, or the creating of a gendered subject is a small thing. This is really key to how this culture responds to the dual challenge of decolonization and the Cold War. So the Palestinians begin after 67 to push for a model of resistance, which is privatized from the state. The state failed. And here they, of course, take from Maoism, they take from Vietnam, they take from Che Guevara, they take from Western Europe. They take the entire publication list of Maspero, of Feltrinelli, they bring it. If you look at the major publishing house, which is the book I'm finishing now, you go into these publishing houses like El Talia, Bashir el-Daouk himself, quite a liberal person, but it's a revolutionary, book list that he's publishing. It's actually really, really interesting that he eventually married Rada al-Saman, who was also a lover of Kanafani, but eventually decided not to go with the revolutionary subject as a feminist, but with this publisher nerd guy. And actually, really, it's really interesting. You can read their love letters of Kanafani and Rada al-Saman, and her critique of the revolutionary subject. As a man is not connected to himself, to his feelings, who doesn't know what is love, and because he's doesn't know anything about the female body, actually, he doesn't know where is what, according to her, he's also not going to liberate Palestine. And I think, and that's the argument. The argument of Rad al-Saman is you're bad in bad, you're not going to, and that's again connected to what PERIN was mentioning. Now, the Arab revolutionary tradition of Mukawama is an international tradition. It is not something that you say, and the Palestinians pioneered this, but they're not, it is actually attract people from all over the world. The revolutionary world, and all over the Arab world. And this is why this argument that we heard yesterday about an internal Cold War and an external Cold War, I'll get to it in the end, but I don't see it from Arab thought. I don't see it from art. I don't see it from gendered subjectivities. Actually, I think it's all actually pretty much a very significant, internal Cold War. But eventually, with the Arab revolutionary tradition, if you go to the training camps of the PFLP and so on, who do you find there? You find Europeans. You really find this whole militarized May 68 and afterwards of May 68. You find it in the Middle East. You don't find it in other places around the world. And these are the people who are also gonna, reject the Dant. They're gonna, they are actually. So why did they come to the Arab world and not, just have their training camp in China, right? They could have had a training camp anywhere. They had it specifically Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, this area, especially Jordan. That was the way to revolt against the global order as it emerged. And the Cold War is a global order, functional, dysfunctional, it doesn't matter, it's a structure. That's the way to reject it. And the intellectual work that was done in the Middle East and the major translations, you can see it even in the novels of Sunala Ibrahim, where they go to the front, to the revolution, but the suitcase is full of books, right? That's what you need to do. You need to read if you want to be a revolutionary. So that's, a very significant sort of global moment in the Cold War that happened specifically in the Middle East and shapes part of it in the, what will become known as sort of terror about, the 70s and on, comes out of this moment. But for them, it is about dignity. It's a different notion of dignity that Nasser coined, but it's the same goal. Finally, the last phase of it is political Islam. We mentioned here political Islam several times, collapsing Iran into the Arab world, collapsing different generations of this phenomenon. I think Osama told us, look, it's a little bit more complex. It's a Muslim Brotherhood. Until the 50s, there's the Muslim Brotherhood. In the 60s, there's a split in the Muslim Brotherhood. And there is political Islam essentially going global in the Cold War. That happened also in the training camps where, if you take the figure of Abdallah Azam, for example, the Palestinian jihadist. He starts, as someone who really he's from Jenin, doesn't really like what happened in 48, even though he was a kid. Really didn't like what happened in 67. Already before that, he wished Nasser death. He goes to Al-Azhar, trains in Damascus, he goes to Al-Azhar, he encounters Qutubism. Qutubism as political Islam is Marxist-Leninist. I don't know if you noticed that. If you think that this is some jihad from the 18th century, this is 60s jihad. The notion of Taliyah is the vanguard. The idea of most people think they're good Muslims but are actually bad Muslims. This is false consciousness. This is completely Marxist. There's no problem of reading political Islam as a political philosophy of decolonization on the Cold War. It's almost like, it's a very easy read. So Abdallah Azam actually wants to do what you do with it, which is mukawama, which is to privatize jihad. In the same way in which iltizam was something that the state does to liberate Palestine, to create this subject, to develop societies, jihad used to be something that the state calls for. not individuals. You couldn't say, hey, I'm about with a bunch of friends for my cafe, let's do jihad. There's no such thing. And it was never a personal commandment, not until the 70s, where it's incumbent upon you, if you're a good Muslim, to do jihad. That comes also from this ecosystem of Muqawma of the late 60s, in the context of the Cold War. And Abdallah Azam goes to these camps because he wants to resist. He wants, his home in Jenin back. He wants to resist. So he goes to the camps, but it's all, the Germans are naked, they're drunk, it's alcohol, it's, this music. What kind of Islam is this? So I cannot resist, I cannot do Muqawama with the PFLP, with the Palestinian guerrillas. That's not gonna happen. So I need my own framework, and that's what he's. There's this really good biography of him, very thick. If you read it, you see that he's building the international jihad in the 70s, step by step, and eventually he's the one who's going to Afghanistan. He's going first to Pakistan, to Peshawar. He's setting it up. He's bringing bin Laden. He's taking it to Afghanistan. There is no global jihad. It comes out of this. And many of you mentioned Afghanistan. But Afghanistan, geographically, it's in Afghanistan. But as an Islamic jihad, it's in Egypt, and it's in these camps that I mentioned. To summarize all of that, if you follow that, it pretty much tells you that the story, we heard it several times, of the Cold War in the Arab world, not really an internal issue, but mostly an external issue. I mean, there was a little bit what, they call the Arab Cold War, between Nasser trying to assert his political project against the monarchies and the Lebanese sort of state, whatever, the Maronites and Shah Malik and all of this. This was taken as the Cold War in the Middle East. It's just completely wrong. Yes, there's a political struggle for hegemony, but the Cold War in the Middle East is inscribed in these subjectivities, in this project of creating a post-colonial subject. And in that sense, first of all, it's very intimate, and then it's associated with violence from the late 60s in very significant ways. Political violence was not part of the collective repertoire until 67. And it was not something that will give you salvation, and it was not something that will give you dignity. But it becomes that when the state fails. And again, the Battle of Karama is the place where you see this, where there's the belief that actually Fanon style, the act of resistance, just by carrying the gun, you are actually being you'll experience rebirth. That's the real Baathism. That's the Renaissance, right? Through violence. It's, of course, violence, the only thing it creates is PTSD. Yeah? It is not going to create, and you can read Fanon that way too if you want. Psychiatrists, after all, but the end of the book, the Wretched of the Earth, in the beginning are not connecting, especially with Sartre's, hot-headed preface to it. The point is that it's very difficult also to explain the Lebanese civil war eventually without that, without violence becoming a solution, actually. I'll stop here with this kind of general thought about the Arab world actually experiencing the Cold War in extremely significant ways as fractured and struggling subjectivities with relation to ontology. What does it mean to be? And with relation to the political projects that came out of it and played a role in the Cold War, especially in the 70s and early 80s. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, for these really rich presentations. I have questions for Holiday and YOAV. I'd like Holiday to maybe try to connect some of the ideas in your paper with Osama's presentation yesterday about the evolution of American empire. you talked a lot about how this first generation of OSS, CAA patronizes modernist art, basically. And I'm curious if something changes by the late 1970s. There's this narrative we have sometimes about the evolution of the CAA, where it goes from being a bunch of like Ivy League guys who are into modernist art and reading complex modernist fiction to guys like Bill Casey, I think, who are more rough and tumble, hard-drinking, Scots-Irish, kind of man's men and so on, who lead interventions into places like Central America and Afghanistan in the 1980s. So I suppose my question is, with this kind of turn in the CAA, is there any kind of turn away from art and culture as tools of hegemony to something a bit harder edged in the 80s and 90s as the Cold War structures move from go away and transition into something else? And then secondly, for YOAV, I really enjoyed this presentation a lot. There's a lot of very rich cross connections. One thing you mentioned briefly was the role of media and kind of Nasser's speech being made into a deed through the radio. And I'm just curious if you had to flesh out the connection between media and ideas further throughout with the emergence of the tape cassette, the video cassette, television, and so on. What would that story look like? Obviously, we all only have 8,000 words or so, so this is not intended as a criticism at all, but I'm just curious how, if you had to build in that media story to the back end of your presentation, what that might look like. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a question for PERIN. So I want to ask a question about the intersection of natalism with your presentation. You mentioned, right, the provision of birth control to Tunisia. Yeah. And I'm wondering, so more broadly, right, how, you mentioned the sort of archetypes, right, of, traditional sort of motherhood in the West, at the same time, right, this is, as the dates don't exactly match up, because you mentioned the change in the 1960s, but of course, publishes the population bomb in 1968, and the West sort of becomes obsessed with birth control, yeah, sterilization and such, and, especially like the out-of-control populations of the third world, and so how does that match up versus on the communist side? So the Soviets are sort of ambiguous, because on the one hand, right, they banned abortion in Soviet in 1934, right, and Stalin is extremely pro-natalist, and they're very concerned with rebuilding the population after the war, but by the 60s and 70s, they're concerned with the fact that they're worried about the Soviet Union becoming a majority Muslim country, and so they're worried particularly about Slavic natalism, right, so they also share concerns about third world population growth, because they're worried about, Slavic populations versus Muslim populations, and then you have China, right, which is this weird position in which it is extremely androgynous in terms of the Cultural Revolution, but Mao was also extremely pro-natalist, right, which is exactly why, China's population boomed so much that's why his successors do the 180 to the one-child policy, right? So how much of this, the different natalist policies, especially the way natalism is kind of, to a certain degree, kind of the mirror image, right, the opposite of these gender roles, how does that play into, the gender projections into the developing world, and MENA specifically?
Thanks for really interesting papers. My first question's for Holiday. At the end, you used the word "punish" at one point for the possibility of punishing artists. I think through funding, maybe you made reference. And I'm just curious if there's any prominent examples that you wanted to share of sort of outliers, artists either in relation to the U.S. or the Soviet Union who didn't hew the aesthetic line that they were supposed to. And how it played out for them, and whether they were able to find space to push back against the dominant aesthetics. And then for PERIN, I was interested in your presentation in kind of the tension between how you depicted the national liberation movements, where you had this sense of, or the way you talked about the sense of the women fighters taking on roles with political power, as opposed to some of the other examples, maybe the Iran examples, for instance, where it was like women go do the education and healthcare things, which in some ways we can just see as like we're going to go beyond June Cleaver, but we're going to let you do policy of June Cleaver. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And I'm just curious if you think that that's a real difference, and if there's something how you might characterize, is there something particular about the national liberation movements that made them a site for something that was more like genuine political power, especially because I think in one of the examples, and I'm forgetting the exact example, but when it shifts to become the state, then then it's like, okay, your exit's over here now for the women, because now we're going to the more gendered masculine norms.
Let's take maybe D3 and then take the next round. Yeah.
Thank you for these. So for the question of what changes by the late 70s and the change in the CIA, this chapter I basically write to 78. So with the sense that there really is a shift that happens with Camp David in terms of the hegemony of American influence, even though really a lot of this continues, so that especially in the USSR, a colleague that I work with was studying abroad in Moscow in the 80s and was describing the way that for Palestinian artists, for instance, they were really actively recruited to Moscow, but also to the GDR, to Warsaw, to Lodz, so on and so forth. I think that in terms of the United States, in terms of the shifts in the United States, like, for instance, the AFME, the American Friends of the Middle East, that is a CIA front. They have a CIA case officer, but their interests are also in working against Zionism. And so part of the role of the AFME is to create this civilizational alliance in between Christian America and Arab Muslims, with the idea of these CIA case officers who are working against Zionism. And so, of course, that shifts. The CCF is exposed in the late 60s. People are appalled. It keeps going still, despite people's apparent horror. I think that I teach in an art school in Qatar. I teach at VCU in Qatar. The first school that opened as part of Education City in Qatar was the art school. That's the late 90s. I think that there is not necessarily a direct line from the CCF to the project of Education City, but I think it's not for nothing that it was an art school that opened first. In terms of the word punish, I was specifically using that in terms of the USSR and frankly the United States, because the CIA really is funding the abstract expressionists, but covertly, because while in the USSR there are actual edicts about the only art is socialist realist, in the United States with the abstract expressionists, everybody on the surface was very critical of abstract expressionism. So the government was very critical of abstract expressionism, but then the CIA was simultaneously funding them, also as yet another ideological sign that look how free the artists are. They can be publicly criticized, but they still do it, and they have their huge canvases that are so free of the government. In terms of outliers, I think part of what has been interesting about this project is that really this is not present as a framework in any of the current scholarship, really, on Arab modernism. So the question within Arab modern art is not, almost never, about looking specifically at what the larger impact of the American and Soviet interventions were. I think a lot of artists certainly identified more in relation to Europe with an understanding of a more historical sense that the the center of art was Europe, and then trying to fight against that. And there's this move, especially in the 60s, with the growth of third worldism post-67, and then into Pan-Arabism, but also for North Africa, Pan-Africanism. So I think that a lot, almost, in some sense, almost every artist can be seen as an outlier. So I work specifically on the Casablanca School in Morocco. They were punished by curators and by collectors and by the sort of apparatus of art because they were abstract artists, academic abstract artists rooted in the intellectual product of modernism as opposed to naive artists that were sort of painting people in bright colors and things like that. And so I think that yes, there are outliers. They're all outliers. There isn't the same way of seeing that sense of punishment when it goes to these external sources. But I also think that what has been very revelatory about this chapter has been how active the influence was. Oh, you have
Yeah, thank you for those. I think first question about natalism, you make a really great case for intersectional and context-based analysis. Obviously, the history of birth control is very much saturated with eugenics and colonialism, right? The first testing of birth control happened in colonies. So let's see. Yeah, it has to be very context-based. In that example, Tunisia was basically seeking U.S. aid to launch its birth control program, and they were kind of, right, they're like being pragmatic. So they're doing it as a part of their nationalist development mission. And I think it's going to look different everywhere in some ways, but it also is going to depend on these concerns about like who needs the birth control, right? Oh, it's the like working classes and the peasants need the birth control, or is it like the working women or anybody needs birth control? So yeah, I don't know if like a lot of it is happening in terms of development and modernization and nationalism. And it kind of connects to the question about the state feminism versus revolutionary, like women's activism. And I don't mean to like sort of dismiss what the Iranian Pahlavi, like state-aligned women were doing at all as like useless or like, oh, they just like put on frilly art shows. And but when you have state feminism, you are kind of constrained by what you can do, especially in a non-democratic context like the Shah's Iran. But then you do have like the image of the woman with the gun as you move towards the Iranian Revolution. So we have figures like that, like sort of militant masculinity, whether by men or women, that also takes place in Iran. Let's see. Oh, and yeah, like Farah, like Empress Farah was a very political figure. I don't mean to like say that whatever she did was not political. Actually, I criticize how she's represented in diplomatic records, especially by the United States. So whenever she like visits the Kurdish regions or when she goes to China, the diplomatic record is like, oh, the Shah is again orchestrating, Farah's appearance in exile. So they were fascinated by her, and they constantly dismissed her agency as a political actor, which is not how she represents herself. So another point I'll make is that for a long time, like socialist, or second world women feminist activism, because they were state feminisms in some ways, was dismissed as like not being real. So I don't mean to do that either with the Pahlavi women either. I think like the Shah's sister was very committed, I think, to women's rights, to her own perspective of women's rights. And more we have research that sort of nuances our understanding of socialist women's activists. So I think both of these make great cases about intersectionality and context Yeah, thanks. Oh, okay.
Thank you. So the question of how the media landscape metamorphoses throughout this period is actually tied to political speech. So Arab political speech of Baathism is Natherism is new. It's a new political language. It is not a language that existed in the 30s or before that, and it is born with connection to the radio transistor. So it's to begin with a language one can broadcast, and also in terms of its register, it is not, it is not the ossified literary Arabic. It's some kind of Wusta, and in that sense, it would allow anyone. I mean, Baathism in writing is actually is a little bit different, but as a broadcasted language, it would allow any small kind of ordinary person with a transistor to experience their life on a bigger stage. You know, everybody in a political system has the need to look up and see their values reflected. That, you know, we know it's very difficult to have this experience again in the world today. But you know, Nasser provides this experience, and as part of that, of course, they control to speak politically is to have access to state media. So eventually all media is nationalized. And whether it's television, which they had early on, or radio or magazines or daily newspapers, this is one conglomerate of speech, which is an ideological conglomerate, and that collapses in '67. The critique is that this is a dead language. It's a language that is divorced from reality. You can read it in poetry, you can, you know, the critique of the language and so on. So that opens the door for a new kind of media and a new kind of speech. So a new kind of media is new kind of technology. Islamists, for example, the way they were able to subvert this structure is with the cassette tape, where you can record your sermon. And Andrew Simons had a very nice book about this in the 70s. You can record your sermon that before that, even 10 years before, nobody could hear. But now this cassette tape can travel, and it's, of course, politicized. And it is an Islamic political speech born anew in the 70s, connected to the rise of new mosques that are not government mosques. Like in Egypt, it is not part of the few thousands regulated. You have, in a matter of decades, about 80,000 mosques. Nobody knows what's going on there. Like, put a speaker, put a green neon, and you're good to go. You just have to be charismatic, and you record it, and the message travels. And it's not only that, it's also the fax machine and the Xerox machine. We know the role in the context of the Iranian Revolution. In the context of the Arab world, they're very significant in countering sort of the political speech of the state. There's also a liberal speech that is kind of struggling a little bit in the background. But eventually what completely kills the political speech of Baathism is Al Jazeera in the 90s. Because until then, the media market is regulated in such a way in which if you wanna listen to the news, it's still, state news, visualized. It's visualized speech, right? It's television. And Al Jazeera now, everybody, if you would go through the 90s, everybody had a satellite dish. They were even not very expensive. And there's a very famous episode that I once saw. I think the show was El-Ittijah Al-Mu'akkas, or one of these, where a Syrian government official comes to the show to confront a Palestinian speaker. Palestinian speakers speak in the new, agile political language of the 90s. The Syrian official speaks in this ossified language of Baathism, with the socialism and the state and the commitment and this heavy pedagogy that already failed. Right? It might look like the Tabqadam, it might look like one of these big state projects, but it's completely dead. And it was like, a boxer from the neighborhood gym going against Muhammad Ali. It was no match. And it was kind of one of these symbolic moments. Then, there are other metamorphosis of this language. But I think language, media, sort of political speech are really neatly intertwined here indeed.
We have Heinrich, then let's take a big one really big group, okay? So Heinrich start.
Do you hear me? Yeah, okay. 2 points, 2 very factual points, actually. Actually, the one for holiday. When you showed us the picture from Syria with the school children, that reminded me of a series of photos that I saw in UNESCO in Paris, which was taken from a schooling program from UNESCO, and I think it was in the context of program of filmmaking in Turkey and in Syria, etc., where they tried to actively encourage domestic film scene that would address progressive subjects like schooling, family planning as well, and a new kind of individuality. Do you have any insights if those arts programs were related to those kind of cultural dissemination programs from the UNESCO? First, very factual question. And then for PERIN, 2 points, 2 remarks. You're certainly right about what you said about Tunisia and the family planning project as something that comes from a neocolonial mindset and then is reappropriated maybe on a local level. I just want to draw your attention to 2 more aspects that might be of interest here. First is the role for female academics in those countries. I know it from the Turkish case as well, who saw these family planning programs as an open door to enter into new kind of academic discussions, also to get funding for gender issues in their country, and also to go to the US, etc., etc. So that might be interesting to look at. And the other thing is there was a series of fatwas actually in the early 1960s about family planning, and I always found that very interesting, although I never really looked inside that. But those fatwas, they try to reconfigure in a way feminist rights inside the political Islam of that period. So that might be of interest to include.
I'll just take all of them together.
Just to make it really hard in the morning, so you have to have a lot of questions. Thank you guys so much for a terrific panel. And I just wanted to kind of echo one thing I heard you all doing, which I think is really important, which is sort of arguing for a kind of independent, dynamic, or timeline for the Cold War on the sort of seen from the ground up in the region. So I love that that's something that comes so clearly through all of the presentations. I also really liked the way all of you dealt with the question of agency as both something that is, there are subjects who are performing and creating and participating at the same time. There are institutions and other kinds of constraints, and that balance I found really compelling in all the talks. I wanted to just push you a little bit kind of to talk about that a little bit more, not that you're not doing already a lot of work around this analytically, but well, I have a quick comment for PERIN, which is if you're looking for more birth control stories, I think a classic one is Open Door Egypt in the 70s. Sadat has authorizes Norplant to come in and do a series of tests, implantations on peasant women, and it's forcible. I mean, they're required to put them in. They won't take them out. There's a whole great article, I think, by Soher Morsi on this, but I'm happy to give you the reference if you want. I think it's a nice way of seeing the direct kind of U.S. pharmaceutical kind of use of women's bodies as a field for experimentation. But I wanted to just ask a little bit more actually about peasant women, about class and race, kind of in thinking about, you do a really nice job of sort of explaining the work of gender, not just as kind of promoting certain kinds of women's labor, but also authorizing certain kinds of politics. So, thinking about, for example, Angie Aflatoon's picture of the prisoner, she's clearly like not a political prisoner. She's represented as a peasant woman, from what I can tell in that portrait. I'm thinking about the kind of energy around the high dam. Of course, one of the most important effects of the high dam is the displacement of the Nubians. And so one of the things that happens is this incredible discovery of like, oh, we didn't really realize that the Nubians lived in a place that weren't just, Babel Beam, they weren't just doormen in Cairo and Alexandria. So this kind of, a lot of the exploration to go south to see the dam for artists and others is really about the discovery of Nubia at the very moment that it's disappearing. And also for the communists. I think that a lot of the communists in this period are really struggling with issues of ethnicity and sectarianism. So the Communist Party in Egypt splits really in the 50s as the kind of more European-focused, largely Jewish leaders are pushed out, and a kind of, a new generation comes forward. And so this is an interesting moment after Suez, when a lot of the locally resident minority communities are forced out. So just kind of wondering about these questions of class, and if possible, race and ethnicity, I'd love to hear more. This is going.
Thank you. For PERIN, can you tell us something, if there was anything specific about the case of Turkey, in the sense, both as a state, as well as opposition movement, I mean, PKK? Yeah. Second, for YOAV, the New Left. The New Left, at least as for the case in Europe, was pretty staunchly anti-Soviet, or very critical of the Soviet. Arguably, if one would place it in the cosmology, was more, let's say, non-aligned to a large extent. Exactly because you mentioned the Cold War was the structure, and we want to get rid of the structure, meaning the socialist camp partially as well. If that was pretty clear, I mean, mostly, as far as I know, in Italy and France, was that much the case, or there is much evidence about even the New Left in the Middle East, and using the critical remarks against the socialist camp as a kind of indicator? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Just a quick question to Holiday and to PERIN. Holiday, have you come across the figure of Taylor Gurney, who was the OSS station chief in Iran during World War II? I think he was a famous curator, and he continued these kind of connections between intelligence and the high arts, and perhaps a path you might pursue. I thought you must have come across him. Okay, and to PERIN, as you mentioned, the PDRY and its kind of progressive policies. Have you worked on the case of the DOFA Liberation Front? Because that would be an example of a liberation movement which was actually fighting and introducing lots of interesting kind of progressive policies on women and women's rights, and I thought this is something very interesting. And thanks a lot, by the way, for mentioning and writing on Ashraf Pahlavi, because I always wanted to read more about her. And I'm really looking forward to reading that. And on a last note, I still have to come across a mentioning of her in CIA documents, which does not note her voracious sexual appetite. So obviously, kind of the pre-Bill Casey generation had problems with that woman and understanding her.
Yes, thank you all for 3 very interesting presentations. My comment is also for PERIN, because you have hit on a favorite subject of mine as well, the Pahlavi women and the way that they're depicted. And this is a great follow-up because I think Ashraf, as you mentioned, also went to China, before Farah Pahlavi did, and partially based upon her own personal connections. She met Zhou Enlai in the 1960s, and she says in her memoirs that she basically was a voice in the Shah's ear ever since, that you should be closer to the Chinese. this is makes sense for us to do this. So I often think about this issue about, and I really agree with you about how they're sort of portrayed and denigrated, but at the same time, there is, as I'm sure you know, a tendency in not just the historiography of Iran, but also left historiography to sort of obscure or reduce the role of women, especially, from the, maybe you call the bottom-up perspective, the average everyday woman. So I guess my question is twofold. First of all, how do we grapple with this very real need to write, the agency of the Pahlavi women back into the story without just engaging in the same historiographical, doubling down of focusing on elites and doing, big women history instead of big men history. So how do we navigate that? And also methodologically and analytically, how do we also, correct for that and find and bring the sort of bottom-up story of women and their organization historically on the left and beyond the left?
Thank you. Before I start, we'll have these two more, and then let's just go until 11, so 15 minutes over, and then we'll have the pause in the next panel, and then we'll just start. Can we roll this into the break so we have enough time for answers? Otherwise, we'll really go over. Yeah. So that we can start at 2 o'clock, okay? So I have two remarks. You don't need to answer them because they're actually also for just everybody, right? 3 remarks, actually. Firstly, if anybody wants to write anybody, I think this would actually be great. So please do this. Like if you have remarks to a colleague who's writing a chapter, please write this to them, right? So point number 2, for PERIN, it seems to me that the question of feminism, it seems to me that feminism and the question of the role of women in society is one of these macro-historical processes that both predates and goes after the Cold War. And I think a lot of what you show is how it starts to intersect. And I wonder whether this can be, once we do the second draft of the chapter, whether this can be teased out more, because it is a really important macro-historical sort of point. Second point, I bring together, or I want to juxtapose YOAV and Holiday. You started, Holiday, with basically what one could call a classical Cold War take. There are 2 big schools, then you qualify them, right, throughout. It's not at all simple. There are these 2 big schools. There's the, socialist realism. There is, there's the US school, and then we start to qualify. There is the Cold War is the way we normally think of it. US, Soviet Union, is central to the way in which you structure what you do. You start in an exact opposite way. There is no Cold War. Nobody talks about it. How do we bring these 2 things together as a structuring feature? Here is one way of thinking about this, and maybe this is something you can also, converse about. I think there are both elements are there, because of course you end up saying, no, it's all about the not quite all about the Cold War, but the Cold War ends up being everywhere, right? And I think what this basically shows us is that in the Middle East and perhaps elsewhere too, we have both these worlds of the Cold War. It's actually not even a dimension. How the way you start is how the Cold War is perceived and lived in the global North. I mean, ultimately, it is something that was started by the US and the Soviet Union. The term itself was coined in the mid-1940s, in Europe. But the way you start you off is a very different sort of Cold War, right? It's the Cold War very often seen, the Soviet Union matters, but it is much more a Cold War that is a mantle for or a form of continuous capitalist US expansion, a continuation of old imperialism, but in a new form. There are 2 things that didn't really come through that much, and maybe this is still something one can talk about. 2 elements that I think are really important in this project. One is the role of Israel as a key proxy and a stand-in. You talk about this quite a bit. Actually, you talk about this in the chapter. The other one that is not talked about is the question of capitalist consumerism, because this is really central to the US, to not only to the US project, but also to how it is seen abroad, right? So I wonder whether in thought, and I should have thought about this when I read the first draft, and I didn't, and I'm sorry. But I wonder whether in thought, in ideas, this also is something that comes out. Sorry, this is a long sort of, macro sort of comment. Okay, let's have one last.
Yes, I'll be brief. As a person with bad hearing and poor English, I could at best catch 10 words from the first two talks, so I have to stick to what was posted on the screen. And I see two paradoxes there. The work by Tatiana Yablonskaya-Bread is chronologically halfway between the Great Starvation of the 1930s and the Soviet begging for cereals in the 60s. So that's just an irony. Second, about gender roles, the time when the US was promoting the housewife is also the time when the new gods of the world were goddesses, that is the American actress movie stars, and not always in housewife roles. So these are not questions, just two short remarks. And I have a question probably to you, to the third speaker. I heard most of what you said. I haven't heard a reference, a hint to the Peace Corps. And the Peace Corps had been created precisely to show to the South that America was not just capitalist America. So maybe you referred to Peace Corps and I didn't hear, or what is your perception of this, in a way, failed project of Peace Corps trying to change the world perception that America is not just money, capitalism, and imperialism?
So let's take this one last question very briefly, and then let's go on to 11. Okay.
A small question for YOAV. To my knowledge, intizam is consideration, and you presented it as a commitment. So is it about being considerate, or what are the connotations in the context that you know, or the culture? And for holiday, I'm interested in the modes of production, because my experience as a former artist in various fields is that there are a couple of things that are happening. One is there's a belief that if you cram artists together, they'll be more productive. So, for instance, in Zurich, where I was when I used to do visual arts, is that they were planning on having a former hotel solve the problem of housing for artists, and at the same time cram them together so much that there will suddenly be a burst of creativity or something like that. And the other thing that I see is that in the film business, where I was in most recently before getting into global governance, the only way, basically, to get large productions done is through a certain funneling, whereby the realism comes in, whatever realism that is. So which processes were in place in order to make the production more steered and more productive, I guess, higher?
Sure. So the relationship between the arts program and the UNESCO film dissemination, I am by no means an expert in Syria, I would say, first of all. I think that we use, like, for instance, so that exhibition, the image that I showed, that was from a whole exhibition. That's the one that won the prize. Apparently, all of the other works, basically, were about families and children and development and things like that. And I think that that is socialist realism. I think that in the way that we use children as a signifier of the future, of what might come in the future. And so I would think about it not necessarily in terms of an immediate connection between these two programs and more in terms of the visual salience of children as a sign of what is to come. And you see that throughout the Third World. You see that certainly within socialist realism, but also throughout the Third World, and in like a lot of Palestinian art as well. I think that incidentally, that's also true for peasant women, so that peasant women, on the one hand, in North Africa, you have a movement of naive artists, so people like Shaibiya or Baya Mahiaddin, who are being shown in Europe specifically because they are from rural areas. It is often repeated that they are illiterate, that they are closer to the truth, that we need to unlearn all of our education to get to where they know something so true. And that's, of course, a very colonial, gendered, classed idea about kind of the native woman closer to the truth. But then in Egypt and beyond, in Egypt specifically, the peasant woman becomes a major motif as a symbol of Egypt itself, as a symbol of the land. Ingia Flatoun has all of these peasant women. All of the Egyptian artists, Mahmoud Mokhtar, has sculptures of peasant women. And so that peasant woman, that idea of the peasant woman, I think comes from this same place of the woman, the falaha, that is sort of closer to the truth, with the idea that they can't speak for themselves, and so the elite is speaking for them, of course. And then again, that also comes out in Palestine, where there becomes also the trope of the birthing woman. So the trope of the mother, again connected to children in terms of the mother that gives birth to the future, that connects people to heritage, connects them to history. In terms of Iran, I would love the reference. I think right now, in terms of where scholarship is, while the main academic group for Arab modernism also includes Iran and Turkey, people have really not made the connection between Iran and the Arab world. So that, again, speaking as somebody whose specialty is in North Africa, I would be hard-pressed to think of references to Iran in either people's exhibition histories, in terms of what they are writing, in terms of where they're showing. That being said, I do think that I've heard that there is a work by one of the Moroccan artists that had been given to the PLO that was then brought to Iran. So I think that there are those kinds of histories. I am not aware of them. In terms of the image state for the socialist realism, that was really just an example that I think is easy to understand of what that is as an aesthetic. And I'm not quite sure about the question about these modes of production. I think that it takes art very broadly to think about what goes into making films, which is of course very different. But I also think that it's true that when you put people together, here we are together, and we are also having something by virtue of sitting next to each other. And so I also do think that's true with artists. In terms of the structure of the Cold War, I will say that, so I have taught Arab modernism for the last 10 years to undergraduates, and I have probably never once mentioned the Cold War. So with the exception that there's a really gorgeous artwork by two Lebanese filmmakers, Joanna Hajatoma and Khalil Jurej, looking at the Lebanese space program. And so I think that there are artists who are interested, contemporary artists who are interested in the Cold War. But in terms of really how Arab modernism has been structured, I come from a background of post-colonial theory. And so I am much more invested in questions of the role of decolonization and this creation of the new subject, as well as the anti-hegemonic networks. I think that what I'm specifically interested within this is trying to say that to some degree, despite all evidence to the contrary, that the discourses of modernism are functioning in this different way, that it is these third worldist networks and non-aligned networks, but that it's functioning as something separate to the Cold War, to say to the contrary, really we can see that both the United States and the USSR were actively intervening in Arab modernism. And so I think that if I were to write about Arab modernism from virtually any other lens, I would never start from this place. But I actually find it very productive, especially with the USSR, to realize the extent to which it is really kind of there at the periphery. But I found 2 articles that are really thinking about this directly, but everything else, you just kind of find a word. Like you see socialist realism mentioned once, or the USSR mentioned once, but it is as if, for whatever reason, probably having to do with language, or having to do with, I mean, we can think about that, why there has been so little from a certainly Anglophone academy that is thinking about the USSR, when in fact there are art historians in the USSR in the 60s who are writing about Arab modernism. There are books that are being published. There are all of these exhibitions. And so I would be interested in thinking together further about what it would be to say that there is an impact of the Cold War without reverting to this kind of classic understanding of the Cold War.
Yeah.
Okay, super fast. I want to repeat, please email these to me. I really appreciate, this is huge, right? Talking about gender and women, Mina, so I am completely overwhelmed. So I really appreciate you just emailing me. But I want to touch upon maybe this Turkey, Iran kind of area. I'm hearing more Ashraf, there'll be more Ashraf in this paper. I actually wrote about Farah more, and Ashraf was a foil figure, but I hear you on my girl. Right? And again, thinking about Turkey. All right, Turkey is mostly coasting, I think, because Ataturk solved all these problems that a lot of Arab majority nations oh, we have suffrage, so they solved, quote unquote, right? We already have the vote. We already don't have this personal status code thing, right? It's not an issue. But I think I am going to look more into sort of female academics and the birth control thing. One example of this is actually Empress Farah comes to Turkey, and she's a huge figure there, and gives a talk. And she talks about her work with leprosy. And a very famous Turkish woman, doctor, is inspired by that. She's also working on her own thing. But suddenly it's all over the news media because Farah talked about it. Now this Turkish woman gets funding, and connecting to the PKK thing, she goes to the East to uplift and civilize, and she kind of talks about, oh, we kicked out the Armenians, but Kurds are that, that's her memoir. She's not being that obviously racist about it, but she's wow, what did we replace the Armenian civilization with? It's not good. It's a mess. So she kind of has her own racially speech about it, uplifting the East, and it's involved with sort of Kemalist womanhood. And the PKK, obviously, the Kurdish resistance fighters, women play a big role. Again, the woman with the gun is a huge part of it. So I will need to say more about that. Yeah, email me everything. Thank you.
All right, Massimiliano, it's a very good point about the new left in Italy being anti-Soviet. In Italy, the way I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, is, okay, there's a communist party, as in France. And, Prague 68 doesn't reflect, very generously about the politics of French communism, which suffers, or this European Communist Party who suffers sort of everywhere in Europe as representative of the Soviet order. You don't have this very much in the Arab world. And the New Left is not very much invested in being anti-Soviet. Also, it depends on the Eastern Bloc for logistical support. I mean, your paper really showed the degree to which the internal sort of German Cold War, and the East Germans actually becomes the sponges logistically. The weapons pass through its, embassies and so on. So there's no point of in the Arab sort of New Left to waste time on that. Also because it's about action. It is not simply an intellectual pursuit that now, as the previous communists of the 50s and 60s will sit and argue. I mean, you can go to this archive in Amsterdam of social movements and see all these debates in the Egyptian that Nancy referred to in the Egyptian, the personal archives of the Egyptian communists. The New Arab Left doesn't care about that. It does have a notion of class warfare. It does think that Arab regimes failed in '67 because they said they're Arab socialists and so on, but they were bourgeois, and this is why they failed. They did prescribe class warfare, but that's already committed to the Ba'ath in the annual conference. I think it was of '63 already. Yassin al-Hafez is the key intellectual there. If they do care intellectually about something, I'll say it's the Frankfurt School. I mean, these kind of ideas, and Herbert Marcuse, these kind of ideas eventually, and as always in our world, first you have these ideas doing some work, the translations come much later. So that's for that, and it shows us actually how people can cooperate as New Left, train together, do operations together, but actually not agree on anything, on everything, which is supposed to be core because it's ideology. The Peace Corps, they didn't care about that. Nobody wrote about it. Nobody I've seen spoke about it. I would just say the U.S. has a very positive image in the Arab world until dramatically it doesn't. It seems for a long time that this is, not the French, not the British. It's anti-colonial itself. It doesn't have this kind of history. And then it's changing very fast, 55, 56, of course, 58. And no Peace Corps or no wheat that you send us or anything like that is going to help. And indeed, who is going to help us? You can do Peace Corps as much as you want, but who is building our dams? The Soviets are building our dams. Iltizam, just really quickly, is a good point. Iltizam is a contested concept. It's a concept over which they struggle. It's one word, but again, as I mentioned, two tradition. And it's not just simply about reflection and consideration. It's also about action. If you're in your studio doing your art, that's very nice. That's not Iltizam enough. You also have to be in the street. You also have to make sure things are changing. Today, we call it activism. And it's the same tension you see in academic units. Scholars who are scholarship for scholarship's sake and scholars who are activists just saying, listen, if this scholarship doesn't do something in the world and it's not directly political, it's an existing tension in the humanities in general. But here it took from two activist traditions, a Sartorian tradition and a Soviet tradition. They fought over it. It's one term. Eventually the state kind of tried to control this thing. But it's specifically about doing sovereignty.
I meant consideration in the sense of being considerate.
In the sense of being considered towards what exactly?
Towards anything, as a word, what it means.
Meaning of it. Is that that's a Turkish meaning? It might be different. It's probably false. Like, we always take Arabic words and change them. I feel like that's probably what happened.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's not what it means in. Not what it means.